Hans van Spakovsky is the manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative and a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. We've done a lot of work together in coalition with other people on election integrity, and we found ourselves in this battle after the 2020 election.
Right.
You've been in the battle longer than I have. You're an authority on election integrity and election-related initiatives. But as an organization and as a movement, conservatives find ourselves in the election integrity space, and we're discovering how far behind we are from the left in that regard. And I wanted to ask you a question about the 2022 election.
Okay.
And very simply, Hans, did conservatives make any progress regarding election integrity during the midterms last year?
They did. And, what happened in 2021 and some in 2022 when the legislative session started was that actually a fair number of states made improvements in their election process. I mean, probably one of the best examples was Georgia. And as you know, the left got very angry about that. Joe Biden went all the way down there and said, all these new changes are Jim Crow 2.0. And they made a series of changes, but the one I would talk about the most and which got the most criticism was Georgia has had a voter ID law in place for quite a while, but it only applied to in-person voting. And of course, what happened in 2020? Huge increase in absentee ballots, okay? So they extended their voter ID requirement to absentee ballots. Now, it's pretty simple to comply with. You either, when you request your absentee ballot, you either send in a photocopy of your ID, or if you got a state driver's license or the state photo voter ID law, you write in the serial number. Okay, that's easy to comply with, but the left went berserk over it. Okay, but what that meant was that the absentee balloting process in the state was more secure. Texas did the same thing. Florida did the same thing, besides making other changes. So we had an improvement in a large number of states. Also, many states, I think about a dozen and a half, banned zuckbucks, the private funding by political donors of election offices, which, as you know, gives them the opportunity to manipulate the way the election is run. And many states banned that. Again, that's a good result.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah.
So progress was made.
Progress is made. Now, depends on the state.
Right.
Some states got worse, but a lot of states got better.
That's good news. That's good news. I'm glad that this is welcome news for not only AMAC members, but whoever's watching this podcast, because we're hearing about these issues every single day. You commented on a recent story. You mentioned how the left went nuts in Georgia.
Right.
And it was completely without merit. But you commented on a recent study that refutes more false claims by the left about voting. And this one is about voter ID and secure elections. Tell us about this story. Tell us about the study and your comments.
This was really an amazing survey. It was done by the University of Georgia, okay? So nobody can claim it was done by some partisan group. And what they did is they surveyed voters to see, what their experience was like in last year's election in comparison to the 2020 election. And the reason that was important was that it was in between the two elections that Georgia passed these reforms, all these ones that Joe Biden and Stacey Abrams criticized. One of the questions they asked voters was your voting experience last year excellent, good, or poor? 0% of black voters said they had a poor experience. 0%.
Zero. I just want everyone to know that. Okay.
I've never seen a zero in a survey before. The overwhelming number of them also, when asked, was their voting experience last year easier or harder than 2020? Because remember, the left was saying, it would be much harder for them to vote. Almost no black voters and almost no white voters said their experience was harder. In fact, something like 95, 96% said it was either easier or just the same, no difference. So again,
it doesn't sound like there was anything negative.
Right.
Nothing negative that came out of the survey.
No. Or like another thing was the twice gubernatorial candidate, Stacey Abrams, kept claiming that there were these huge long lines at polling places everywhere, and that was suppressing votes. So the survey also asked, how long do you have to wait? Huge numbers said, I don't have to wait at all. And even larger numbers said, I waited about 10 minutes. Upwards of 90-something% said they either didn't have to wait at all, or the most they had to wait was 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So again, there were no long lines.
Another argument on the left, shot to heck, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about good states and bad states and how progress was made. This is a struggle, and unfortunately, the left does have, I don't know how many decades head start on us with
Right.
regard to administering elections, working elections. I think that it was on one of the calls that you and I are on where somebody mentioned that the left collects ballots and the right collects votes, and that's a big difference. So, what
I haven't heard that, but that's actually that's a very accurate assessment.
isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
What more has to be done from the conservative perspective about election integrity? As we head into next year's presidential election, I know there's a lot, but we are making progress. But there's still much more work that has to be done.
Look, this is a state-by-state fight, and a tool that you know about that people can use for this is the election integrity scorecard that the Heritage Foundation premiered about a year ago. Here's what we did: is we came up with 47 different best practices criteria to judge each state by. I mean, for example, do they have a voter ID law? If they do, does it apply to both in-person and absentee ballots? What do they do to clean up their voter registration rolls? Do they do a database comparison with their state DMV list? So when people change their address on their driver's license, it changes their registration. It's just basic stuff like that. We then analyzed every single state to see what they do, and we then gave them a rating. So you can go to the heritage.org website, pull up the election integrity scorecard, and pull up your state, and it'll show you exactly what your state is doing right and exactly what it's doing wrong. The best state in the country right now after the recent legislative changes is Tennessee, but their score is like an 83 or an 84. So they still have improvements that can be made.
Right.
It doesn't surprise you, I'm sure, to know that the worst states in the country are places like California and Nevada.
There you go. I cited that data that you just talked about in an article I wrote about election integrity for the AMAC magazine. So Heritage, thank you for putting that out.
But the point is, if folks want to know what they can do in their state, what they need to call their state legislators about, just pull up our scorecard in your state. It'll tell you what you need to tell your state legislator. Hey, why aren't we doing this?
Exactly right. Why do we have such a low score with voter ID? Why do we have such a low score with ballot trafficking or ballot harvesting?
Right.
And that's great because it puts the words in their mouth when they pick up the phone to call their legislature or legislator. How important is the Secretary of State's role in election integrity, or a state's Secretary of State in election integrity?
Well, it's very important. The Secretary of State is the chief election official in the vast majority of states. There's a couple of exceptions, like in North Carolina, they have a state board of elections that runs through. But it's the Secretary of State that really sets the tone. And to give you an example of how important this is, look, right now there is an ongoing lawsuit against the Secretary of State of Michigan, a Democrat. You know why? Because a good group, you know them, Public Interest Legal Foundation, got a hold of the state's voter registration list and checked it against death records. And they found 27,000 people who are registered to vote who are dead. And they sent the list to the Secretary of State saying, look, you should know these people shouldn't be on the list. And the Secretary of State of Michigan refuses to take them off the list. So that right there tells you that Secretary of State's really important to whether or not Michigan has an accurate voter list.
Yeah. So when an election comes up for Secretary of State, I want everybody to keep in mind how important that position truly is.
Yeah, and those races used to be ignored.
I think to a certain extent they still are.
Yeah, but nobody ever paid any attention to them. And now I think finally people are realizing how important that position is.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about paper ballots.
Sure.
We've heard from a lot of people, particularly here at CPAC. People have been stopping by the booth because they know that AMAC and AMAC Action is involved in election integrity.
Right.
Talking about the accuracy, claiming the accuracy that paper ballots are accurate versus a touch screen. And a lot of people have opinions on how touch screens and voting machines can be manipulated, and paper ballots are paper ballots. What do you think about the accuracy of paper ballots?
Well, look, if you're talking about hand counting millions of paper ballots, particularly in the, that is going to be full of errors. Not only that, but hand counting of paper ballots is the easiest way to steal an election. If you're talking about paper ballots that a person fills out and then it goes through a computer scanner which counts it, well, then you have an audit trail. If someone claims that the computer scanner has been somehow jiggled or somehow has a virus in it and it's not accurately counting it, well then yeah, you've got the paper ballots and you can hand count them and you can compare the two. But if you're talking about hand counting all those ballots, that's a very inaccurate way of doing it. Now, with electronic voting machines, I don't think folks should be using the electronic voting machines that have no paper printout, okay? The newest machines, you select your candidates and then it prints out a paper list with the names of the candidates on it so you can check it, make sure it recorded it correctly, and then that paper ballot is sent through a computer scanner to count the names. There you've got a triple audit trail. Now, the one thing you have to be very careful of with those is some companies are, unfortunately, selling a machine that it does print out a piece of paper with the names of the ballots on it, but it also has a barcode on it. It has a barcode, which is a supposed summary of all the candidates you chose.
Right.
And when you run it through the computer scanner, it's not actually reading the written names, it's reading the barcode. Well, that doesn't do you any good because you have no idea whether the barcode accurately reflects the names that have been printed out. So I just think you want to be sure it's a system that has an audit trail and two ways to count the votes.
That's great. Hans, thank you so much for stopping
Sure.
by. It's always a pleasure to speak with you here at CPAC and elsewhere. Keep up the wonderful work you're doing at Heritage.
And I got to tell you, I know the kind of work your members do, particularly in the grassroots, and boy, thank goodness that they are out there working on this issue.